Thank you, Scott. Thank you, all the three panelists. I think we've heard problems, but also possible solutions. Not easy to implement. I should say that Italy perhaps has a legal system that does not allow these kind of targeted sanctions, but because the EU has taken a communal decision to try and apply them as much as possible, not necessarily for the topics that we have discussed today, but certainly there is progress, and without actual participation from lawyers and activists, this would have never happened. And also the Magnitsky case itself was a horrible story, but if it wasn't for his lawyer that has started to lobby the parliaments around the world, we would not be discussing these kind of measures today. Thank you once again. We have 3 minutes, but as Dave has said in the chat, we can stay on with the room, and possibly also people that do not have other meetings to attend to can stay. And I'll give it back to Dave for either conclusions or perhaps if there's Q&A. And I think there's already something from Kenzie posted in the chat, but if you want to raise your hand, Kenzie, you can ask directly a question to Scott, so there anybody can listen to that. Kenzie.
Thanks, Marco. And I want to say, especially for our speakers, since we didn't discuss previously the possibility of extending the meeting time, you're under no obligation to stay longer if you can't, and no pressure. But if you are available, would like to continue to take questions or your comments, respond, that would be great too. And I'll keep things open for as long as discussion is good. And we are still recording, and we'll be posting the session to YouTube. I have to check with our video person, but hopefully sometime this week. The easiest way to, best way to seek the floor, if you'd like to ask a question or give a comment, is to use Zoom's raise hand function. In certainly in the version I'm using, you go to participants and you can raise your hand there. I'll be looking at that. I'm not sure if I will be able to actively monitor the chat myself. I'll mention one of our speakers, Scott, has indicated he has 10 minutes. So, with that.
Sorry to interrupt, because Kenzie cannot speak now. Can I ask this question to Scott? So he has to go. I mean, Kenzie Rambu-Yazemuli is asking if there's any paper of yours or fact sheet compiling what you just exposed, and if there's any precedents. Pakistan perhaps could be an interesting case to rely on.
Yeah, we do have a couple fact sheets, and I'll be happy to send those along to David to share with the wider group. They don't focus specifically on the Pakistan case, but because that's of particular interest here, I can also share those links with David to share with everyone.
Thanks.
Do we have any questions or comments?
I see other comments in the chat, but I don't know if Ruth Birgin is still in the room. I see Rose has raised their hand.
Okay, great. Rose Trano from iDefend.
Yes, thank you. Can you hear?
Yes.
Yes, thank you for this opportunity to very good sharing and also updates on the war on drugs and the Magnitsky Act. Really very interested on the Magnitsky Act. Actually, in the Philippines, we are from in Defense of Human Rights and Dignity movement, and we have been thinking about the Magnitsky Act of the US and also of the European Union, which we would like to perhaps have a study session later on the comparison of both global mechanism. So we would be guided on which one we can actually use. Because at this time, as shared by our friends from Akbayan, the mechanism in the Philippines is actually not in effect, not effective. The ICC, we hope that it will be pursued, but of course the Philippines will not cooperate on the ICC. So we really have to have a backup mechanism, and although the Magnitsky Act would be limited to some extent, we still want to have those options. Perhaps a class suit I do not know if that would be applicable to the Magnitsky Act, a class suit of EJK families who can file cases, because at this time there is really fear of filing individual cases, not because of retaliation, but perhaps a class suit may be more effective and may encourage more of the victims to file cases. Thank you.
Thank you, Rose. So to answer your two questions, the first regarding US versus EU Magnitsky, so you're absolutely right. The European Union adopted a similar form of legislation last December. There are some differences in it, and I would just focus on two very quickly. The first being legal differences, and then the second being practical differences in application. So in terms of legal differences, the EU regime would suggest that it's more inviting than the US regime in theory, in that the thresholds of crimes are lower to reach. What I mean by that is twofold. One, it covers a broader swath of crimes than the US regime does, including basically all types of foundational human rights, such as even violations of restriction of freedom of the press, or restrictions of freedom of religion, and so on, freedom of assembly, which are not covered in the US program. The US program only covers violent abuses against victims. And then secondly, is that it also doesn't have the same type of statute of limitations that the US program does. So the US program is limited to abuses that have happened within the last 5 years, whereas the EU program is not. So on paper, it would appear to be more inviting. In practice, at least for the time being, the US program is still a more viable program. First off, just because it's been around much longer. It is at this point better funded and better established. There's an entire program dedicated to making it work in practice. And also the US has a longer and more aggressive history of sanctioning than the European Union does, in many ways that are not positive, but also lend itself to being more willing to engage in sanctions in this way. So that being said, there's actually no reason to not attempt to apply for sanctions under both mechanisms. And part of what we're trying to help partners navigate, and what we're working on navigating ourselves with programs as new as the European Union program, is a path forward for learning how we can use both programs. As I mentioned before, all of the different jurisdictions have really started focusing pretty heavily within the last 3 to 4 months on multilateral designations. So submitting viable information to every jurisdiction that uses these types of programs would have the effect, we believe, of increasing your chances that it gets acted on any one or all of the jurisdictions. To your second question on the bringing a class suit type action, that's not exactly the way that targeted sanctions work. They're not a criminal mechanism. They're really an administrative law mechanism, right? So they're a way through which governments can use their sovereign power to restrict access to certain sovereign benefits to certain people. So really, the important thing I just want to emphasize here is that whenever you're submitting for a targeted sanctions case, it needs to be focused more on the perpetrators than on the victims. And this can be a little bit odd for a lot of civil or human rights advocates who tend to be very victim focused, as I believe we should be. But really, you're working on building a prosecutorial document, right? And that, of course, includes information about specific victims and includes crimes that have happened against them. But it's really about building a case that specific people who you think should be restricted and penalized are involved in those crimes and demonstrating their culpability for them. Yes, it can be class in terms of demonstrating that these people have been involved in widespread activities against many victims, but you need to be able to draw discrete connections between specific violations and the culpability of actors for those violations.
Well, we have a raised hand from, I believe, Widya Sadnovic.
Yes.
Welcome.
Thank you. Thank you, David. I'm sorry I cannot turn off my I turn on my my camera. I'm on another meeting, but thank you for convening this meeting. I really appreciate the informative presentations from all the speakers. I just would like to respond to the statements and also presentations by Madam Tirta from the ICGR on the case of the death penalty and also the drugs case in Indonesia. Indonesia is committed to fight against the misuse of drugs and also narcotics, and we believe that the death penalty is still the positive law in Indonesia to deal with extraordinary crimes, including the drugs abuse and also the terrorism and other extraordinary crime. And we would like to reaffirm the sovereign right of all countries to develop their own legal system, including determining appropriate legal penalties in accordance with their international law obligations. But at the same time, of course, the discussions on the abolitions, moratoriums, or the continuation of death penalty is kick and live and going in Indonesia. I believe Madam Tirta from the ICGR could also mention this. There's also always discussions on these aspects on how the judicial could also improve the determination of the case. I believe the judicial system is also independent, and the discussions, considerations from the judge is not only from the point of view of the perpetrators, but also the victims and also the interests of the broader public. So I would like just to put my interventions on the record on responding to the case of death penalty and drugs in Indonesia. Thank you, David.
And we have a question for Scott, if you have a couple of minutes, from Gang Badoy Kapati of the Philippines.
I will. Every time there's a gathering like this, we really tend to stay in theory. So and we speak in large waves. But I'm going to start with something very, very specific, and then maybe the large answer can come. I'm very good friends with a particular family who lost a daughter, a sister, my age. She's actually my batch. She was murdered in October, early part of the Duterte administration. And she was one of those, if you've seen the pictures, hog-tied and left on the road near their residence, near my residence actually. And they labeled her celebrity pusher. Because she's part of the society circle that parties a lot. And I know her, we grew up together. I know this, I'm saying the specific, and then there's a large question. We all surmised, why was she part of this? Why was she murdered? A, B, C, D. And we realized she partied a lot. She dated a club owner. And we're assuming, this is just me surmising, not fact, that the club owner also knows who distributes drugs, illegal drugs, and that they probably know who's in charge. So she's a girlfriend of someone who is in the middle of all that. My question is, now ICC comes in and my friend's family doesn't even want to come forward with anything, even if it's clearly extrajudicial killing. Clearly, there were 1,000 other methods to go about this, but there was certainly, it was her knowledge of who was involved that got her killed. Perhaps she used to, I don't know. So my question is, we do have specific sanctions. You said specific actions. I'm actually more curious about the coin reverse of that, which is there a chance for other countries to come in and offer safety, security, or what do you call it, as an asylum protective offering spaces for those who can come out? Because right now, as everybody has agreed, a lot of the witnesses even victims, even directly enraged, offended, tragic scenarios, they won't come out because of fear of safety of everybody else who's still alive. Is there a way to have a provision like this? Is that, I know we're targeted on function, but somebody mentioned about victim-centric. So I want to be focused on the family of the victims and what kind of security or safety assurances can we give them that when they come out and speak for justice for their loved one, that there is a space that they can go to that will protect them in the process of this justice. Otherwise, the large bully wins again because it's our silence, because we're feeling unsafe. So that's my question, coming from a very specific, personal, very close story to a large question. Is there a chance, Scott, for us to actually work with perhaps the EU or other countries to actually offer sanctuary for people who might need to come out for justice with a lot of fear, and heartbreakingly, they might end up just staying silent. And I respect that. That's survival. I want to give them space when they can still survive while getting justice. Hopefully that wasn't such an abstract question. I tried to be as clear as possible.
No, not at all. Thank you for asking it. And I'm also very sorry for you. It's a horrible situation.
It is. I grew up with this girl. So it's her older sisters and her mother that I need to deal with, partly to convince them to come out. But I know I can't unless I can guarantee them safety. Because right now, everyone is zipped. And Justine, I can see you are nodding because this is, I'm just giving one example. And this is even a franchised family. They're not even disenfranchised. They're wealthy. They're established. They can call senators, but the fear is frozen. Can you imagine what it is like for other more disenfranchised players? So justice might
Thank you. Let us see if, because Scott has to go. So if you have another couple of minutes, Scott, and you want to react to that, and then.
Yes. Yeah. Thank you, Marco. And thank you. So I should first say I'm not an asylum attorney. So I can't give you a lot of great advice about, what countries or where and how to apply for asylum for people who would like to be involved in this type of work. I know there are jurisdictions in which that could be available to them. Not because they're going to help with this necessarily, but because they genuinely fear for their lives in a reasonable way. What I can say is that within the context of working with the US government on sanctions programs, they understand the threat to local civil society and they take it very seriously, as do we. So one of the first things we always help organizations understand is the steps that we can help them take to keep their information confidential while they're working with us. And the ways in which the US government also works to keep that information confidential. And so the very short answer is to say that the chances, if we all do our jobs right, the chances that that the perpetrators, once sanctioned, would be able to track back that information to sources that provided it is extremely low. As a lawyer, I can't say, I can't in all good faith say it's zero, but it's something close to zero. And we have never seen it happen in practice. The US government does a really good job of keeping this type of information confidential and working with representatives of victims, civil society organizations representing them, to keep their information safe. So yes, there's a lot of confidentiality that goes into these programs, and we have worked with many local partners who genuinely fear for their lives, who have decided to take the step of doing these types of cases. And I should certainly say, along with what you said, we never put any pressure on individuals or organizations to do so. It has to completely be their decision and local partners' decisions as to whether or not they want to do this. But we have helped partners in similar situations to make these types of submissions successfully and to avoid any type of repercussions against them. All of that to say, it's not that there wouldn't be repercussions if people found out. There is a certain amount of risk, right? And I can say, one specific example of when we helped local partners make a submission against some militia leaders who were involved in extrajudicial killings. And once they were sanctioned, they went on a manhunt trying to find the people who had provided information against them. And our partners were genuinely afraid for a few months while the manhunt was going on. Luckily and gratefully, we had done our part and they had done their part, and none of this information came to light, and eventually it blew over. But it can be very serious. These are major penalties that make powerful people extremely upset, and they will look to try to retaliate if they can. So I don't want to minimize the risk, but I do want to be realistic about the fact that there are procedures in place to keep people safe if they want to engage in this type of accountability.
Thank you for the answer. I appreciate it.
So in my rush earlier to ensure there was time for Scott to be able to address Gang's question, I neglected to I want to thank Mr. Sadnovic for joining us today and sharing the government's perspective.